Good evening, one and all. I am your Belle au Bois Dormant, heir to the throne of France. After a highly restful 100 years, it is so wonderful to be back, bitches.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Disney Reel to Reel, a deep delve into the Disney animated canon. I'm your host, Wyatt, and today I am accompanied by a true expert in fairy tale media and analysis. She is the Cendrillon to my Schneewittchen, you might say, Miss Abigail Fine. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
Yes, of course. So would you mind telling us a little bit about what got you into fairy tale analysis and the long path you have taken through this journey?
Yeah. I guess like most of us, I just started out loving Disney. I started going to the parks when I was 4 years old, I think, and absolutely believed that the princesses were real princesses and had a fight with someone in the daycare about it. So, it's in the blood, as they say. But I started working on my PhD on Cinderella adaptations circa 2018, but I had the idea for the PhD a couple years before. So I've really been working on fairy tales since 2016 now. And my thesis project is focusing on Cinderella adaptations from 1922 to 2021, so a century of Cinderella. But I also have taught classes on like approaches to fairy tales and the different methodological approaches that you can take to study fairy tales.
Very, very nice. I envy your time and resources into doing all of this research. That's very good. Could you tell us what the first Disney movie you saw was?
I'm assuming it was The Little Mermaid. That's I think that's the one that my mom says that I put on we had the VHS of it and that I would watch over and over and over, and she'd have to just rewind it and start it again. So I think I don't really remember, but I think it was Little Mermaid.
It's a very good pick anyway. Yeah, I feel like it's sort of that thing where it's like if you were born in like the late 80s to mid 90s, you're probably going to stick with the movies of the Renaissance.
Hmm.
Like that's just how it goes. You might get some classic ones thrown in there somewhere, but for the most part, I think that's why the millennials tend to gravitate towards
Hmm.
all of those.
Yes. Yeah, I remember when I was little, I thought that Disney movies came out every summer, like as a rule. Like I assumed that had been happening for all of time because, I was 4 or 5 and we just kept getting these great films every summer. And it was like, it's time for the Disney movie. And now that I'm an adult, I realize that I was in a very specific pocket of Disney films. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess we can go ahead and jump into our discussion today, which is on the 1908 silent film version of La Belle au Bois de Mont, or Sleeping Beauty for the plebeians. Not throwing shade. Um, yeah, would you mind giving some of your like general thoughts on the movie before we get into it?
Yeah, so I hadn't actually watched this one before. My research hasn't really focused too much on the silent film versions of any fairy tale. I've watched several silent film versions of Cinderella, of course. But yeah, so this was my first watch of it. And it interestingly, I thought aesthetically looked a lot like what we end up with in the 1959 Disney film of it. It's got the medieval stuff going on. The story cuts off after the prince finds the princess. It doesn't do the full Perrault, which goes in some really odd directions that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute.
Oh,
But yeah,
yes.
yes. But I was impressed with it. So as I said, this isn't exactly my area of expertise, but there is a great book on film and fairy tales. That's literally what it's called, Film and Fairy Tales, by Kirsten Moen. And she talks a lot more about these silent films. And in particular, she talks about how this is part of the cinema féerie, or the fairy cinema of sort of this period of French cinema, and that it is coming out of a theatrical tradition. And I think it definitely has that theatricality to it, sort of looking at a stage set and a proscenium in a way that later films are going to start experimenting more with camera angles. But it definitely has that feel of watching a play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one thing I noticed, because at this point we will have discussed a 1903 version of Alice in Wonderland.
Mm-hmm.
And spoilers for you and our listeners, we will be tackling versions of Pinocchio and Snow White, which came out within like 4 years of each other. And with the exception of Pinocchio, I would say that they all follow that format of like a stage tradition that's being adapted to screen, and sort of the notion of, we are simply taking this production that you could easily find at your local theater or a grand event for the wealthy elite or what have you, and putting it on film for the masses to consume, which is very interesting. But yeah, I was kind of a little put off by the staginess of it all, just because it's like, we'll get into it later, but some scenes were shot in a studio soundstage. Others were shot at an actual castle. So it's like you give and take with what you're given. It's very clear contrast.
Yeah, no, I agree. I felt like the staginess was very interesting. But I thought that their use of special effects was pretty advanced. I really enjoyed the way that the evil fairy appeared in the film. It looked a lot like how the Wicked Witch of the West appears in The Wizard of Oz, though I am assuming that they didn't use a practical effect for this one the way they did for the 1939 film. But it had that the version that we watched, somebody had done some kind of colorization too, which I assume probably wasn't part of the original audience's experience, though I don't know. But they had sort of flame colored the explosion of smoke that the fairies appear in, and my first thought was just, this is the Wizard of Oz, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, I thought that they did some really good special effects with that. I mean, they're obviously easy effects to do now. Like we can say, oh, well, of course. But it did seem like if I were in an original audience watching this, I would find it pretty magical.
Oh, what a smell of sulfur. Anyway. Now we have to get in some general stats. There isn't a ton of information out there about this movie, so I kind of had to grab whatever was deemed essential. But here's the skinny, so we say. It's a French short. It clocks in at 14 minutes and 14 seconds. The only release date we have for it is that it debuted on the 5th of April, 1908 in the United States. So who's to say when it premiered for the French audiences to enjoy and consume. It was directed by Albert Capellani and Lucien Nonguet, cinematography by Segundo de Chaumont, and unfortunately there is only one performer given credit, and it's not even on screen, but it's Julianne Mathieu, And we only know this because she was the wife of the cinematographer. So it helps to be in the business, I guess. Special effects, they do comprise of mostly stop motion tricks and some double exposure, which is what you were talking about with the fairy's appearance and disappearance and whatnot. And the interior scenes were shot at Pathé Studios in London. Actually, I should have looked into that. Do they have a French division? I'm not quite sure.
I assume.
Yeah, makes sense, because aren't they like a general like Europe branch media thing?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Even I learned things on this podcast. It's totally great. But the exterior shots were filmed at Pierrefonds Castle in the Guise department of Picardy, France. And what's interesting is that the castle had actually been reconstructed in 1885. And it was actually one that was built around like the 14th century. So, historical accuracy with our filming locations. We love to see it. Actually, while we're at it, could I go ahead and ask, were you able to pick out of like whether you thought the costuming was historically accurate or...
Well, this is an interesting question, actually, about like historical accuracy with fairy tales. That opens an entire can of worms. But I think something that you will find interesting if you or the audience reads the Perrault version of the tale. So Perrault's version of La Belle au Bois Dormant, or The Beauty of the Slumbering Woodlands, which is how it's translated in my version, was originally published in 1697. And it very much takes place in 1697. So you get a lot of, or potentially in 1597. So you get a lot of like references to modern or contemporary things that Perrault would have known. So there's a moment when the princess, I'm assuming most people have seen at least the Disney Sleeping Beauty and know that she pricks her finger on a spinning wheel or on a distaff and falls into a slumber. But when she does that, people are running around trying to wake her up initially, and they say like to bring her some of the ointment that preserved the Queen of Hungary. And that's a reference to, let me find the exact reference, but it's reference to a Hungarian queen at the time, to Elizabeth of Poland, Queen Consort of Hungary from 1320 to 1342, who had credited l'eau de la reine d'Hongrie, which is the scent, with preserving her beauty and strength. And women at the court of Louis XIV would have used it as a perfume, which would have been contemporary to when Perrault was writing. So this was something that had originated in the 1300s, but was actually still very much in use in Perrault's everyday life. And then later on, when the princess sleeps for 100 years, which is what it is in the fairy tale, even though it's like 5 minutes in the Disney film, she sleeps for 100 years, and then the prince comes to wake her up. And it says something about how he doesn't mention about her high collar, which makes her look like his grandma. So basically it's saying that she's in a dress that's completely out of fashion, because fashion has continued for 100 years while she's been asleep, and she's in this old fashioned dress. So yeah, it is interesting to think what is the quote unquote time period of this? Are they going for the 1300 look? Are they going for a 1600 look or a 1700 look? I would say this film appears to be styled more medieval than early modern, or 17th century. And that was interesting to me, because that seemed to track with what they end up doing with the Disney film, where the Sleeping Beauty in that is much more medieval than their other major Perrault, Cinderella, which is very 19th century in its styling.
Mm-hmm. I will say up front that with the prince and his riders, soldiers, however you want to categorize them, they didn't have any like exposition or title cards in this film, so you just kind of have to go with what you see. But they did have kind of like a Three Musketeers energy to them, you know. D'Artagnan would be so proud.
Oh yeah. No, I definitely was getting Three Musketeers off of it. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it was. I did keep expecting there to be some kind of title card, in French or English, but there was nothing. It was sort of like watching a charade production of of Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah, and we'll get to that a little more in the plot breakdown. Um, but I guess now would be as good a time as any to just give a little bit of a profile on Charles Perrault. um, he was born on the 12th of January, 1628, in Paris, into a very bourgeois family. He was the seventh child of Pierre and Paquette Leclerc, which, I'm sorry, I just love French names from time to time. Like, they're just so elegant and prim and proper, and that one's just very over the top, and I love it. Um, but anyway, as a young man, he would study law before entering into the field of government service, as his father and his elder brother, Jean, had done. But he developed this interest in academia, as he was involved in the Academy of Sciences, the Academy of Painting, and he was even appointed secretary of the Academy of Inscriptions and Belles-Lettres. He even served under Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the finance minister of King Louis XIV. So he's rubbing elbows with the big boys. Um, he also wrote literature at this time for his head painter, Louis Levaux. Um, I did not look into much of that, I'm not going to lie, but this isn't a literary podcast for the most part, so we're good. Then in 1871, he was elected to the Académie Française, or the French Academy.
1671?
1871. Oh my
No,
gosh.
1671.
Then why did I write that down? Oh.
I don't know, but he lived between 1628 and 1703.
Yes, I am terribly sorry. I need to make a call to Wikipedia. So, 1671, he was elected to the Académie Française, or the French Academy, which was the council for matters pertaining to the French language. And then he had to just go on rocking that boat by writing articles about the superiority of modern literature to ancient literature.
So this is actually a thing that was happening in France at the time. It's called the Quarrel of the Ancients and Moderns. And you got a lot of learned men who were essentially arguing that ancient literature was better than anything that any contemporary person would ever possibly write. And Perrault took the side of the moderns in the quarrel between the ancients and moderns. And in part, he did this because he was writing at the time. But I think what's important to note about the writing milieu that he was in is that it was really female dominated, which is why a lot of the men were saying that nothing would be better than what the ancients wrote. And so while Perrault is the best known French fairy tale writer from this period for us today, at the time, he was actually one of the only men writing in this really female dominated milieu that included like Madame d'Aulnoy. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that a little bit, but it was these very upper class French women, aristocratic women. And Perrault was not an aristocrat. He was kind of related in by birth, but as you've been saying, he's a bureaucrat. He's like doing all these things. So he was actually status wise a little bit below these women. And so he's taking the part of the moderns because it is going to, in his mind, help his own reputation, and as well as the women that were writing as well, though I don't really know where he stood in terms of like proto-feminism. But yeah, so it's a really interesting little debate there with him supporting the moderns in that quarrel.
That is a very pertinent little nugget that I did not find at all. Now it makes so much more sense.
Yeah. And if you want to read a lot more about the salon culture and these literary fairy tales, there's a book by Jack Zipes called Fairy Tales and the Art of Subversion. And I believe it's the second chapter in that book that has an entire overview of the women who were writing and sort of their aims and goals with their writing, which was both to give themselves some more independence, to write themselves roles where they were able to say and do more socially than they could legally do within their society. But also it was the fairy tales served as sort of a civilizing force as well. There's some contradictions within it. But yeah, Jack Zipes' Fairy Tales and the Art of Subversion, or Ruth Bodegheimer's book, Fairy Tales: A New History, also gets into this. She and Jack Zipes don't agree with each other about a lot of a lot of things about fairy tales and their transmission. But ultimately, both of those books have a really good overview of the birth of the literary fairy tale.
I don't know if I should support or condemn Jack Zipes on this podcast, but if it's for the sake of historical awareness, by all means, please read it.
Yeah, he does not like Disney at all. So, since this is a Disney-focused podcast in a lot of ways, maybe not. But he is great. He does have some amazing scholarship. So,
Yes, I'll at least give him that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Now, at age 56, Perrault was forced into retirement from the French Academy by Colbert, and he decided to focus more on epic poetry and his Christian faith. Sorry. The listeners can't see this, but I'm imagining like a stained glass window that he's like putting his hands above in reverence. Anyway. And then 11 years later, he would lose his position as secretary, and he decided to devote himself to his 2 children. 2 years later, he would publish Tales and Stories of the Past with Morals, or the cringiest title, Mother Goose Tales. Yeah. And among the most iconic were Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, and Puss in Boots.
Mm-hmm.
And for better or worse, this is how we connect with him to this day. All of his political transcripts, they've proven to have served their purpose. And now we're just here to talk about girls in pumpkins and spindles. And it's all fine and good. And unfortunately, he would pass away in Paris on the 16th of May, 1703, at the age of 75. Leaving behind a legacy that is hotly contested to this day.
Yeah, I actually think the use of Mother Goose for Perrault is also really interesting. I have a great book here. Sorry, I just like keep pulling out these books. I do a lot of reading for my PhD. But Christine A. Jones has a book called Mother Goose Refigured, a critical translation of Charles Perrault's tales. So it does have a translation of all the fairy tales, but she has a really good introduction. And she writes that so the book was also dedicated to, oh gosh, it's the princess. They are just calling her Mademoiselle, but I know that that's not it. The book was dedicated to the daughter of Louis XIV's brother. So the daughter of a son of France. So the brother would have been next in line for the throne after the king's own son. So it's dedicated to a princess. And in the frontispiece, it has the princess and Mother Goose together. And so she writes that the coupling of Mother Goose and Mademoiselle, or the plain woman teller and the young mondaine, worldly wise royal, epitomizes a paradox in the style of the tales that scholarship has long attempted to reconcile. Are the stories primitive or modern? Are they courteous or canny? oral tradition or literary history. And she goes on to say that Mother Goose and the Princess together framed the 1697 collection as a testament to the oral history and literary poetics, both of which underwent extraordinary innovation at the hands of the fairy tale writers in the 17th century. So it is this interesting mix of the figure of the old woman storyteller with somebody like young and upper class and sort of mashing them together. It's also Charles Perrault. So he never actually took credit for writing these tales. Like, we know he did, but his name's not actually in there. But it's sort of him hiding behind the mask of a female storyteller, which happens a lot, actually. It happens with the Grimms later in 1812 when they publish. They have an old woman storyteller as their frontispiece. It's almost as if the figure of the old female storyteller lends this kind of credibility and authenticity to fairy tale. And arguably, Disney kind of does the same thing in a lot of ways. We have all these princesses that are the face of Disney when Disney is a guy. So it's like all these men that keep appropriating these women's tales and putting them as the frontispieces and then moving on. I think it's really fascinating and interesting.
Oh, yes, definitely. In fact, I don't know if we can make any discussion topic at this point without catering to Disney, because that's the way my brain works. But going back to what you were saying about how men appropriate fairy tales and put like a female voice in front of them, I'm not sure. I mean, the fact that it doesn't help that a lot of the Disney adaptations, they cater to both the original text and to the times in which they were produced.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting how like we're left with these archetypes of both fairy tale perfection who shall fall unconscious should their dainty little ass finger prick a spindle. And yet we also have characters like Snow White and Cinderella who reflect the values and the expectations of women during the Great Depression and recovering from the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of see that women of the 30s and the 50s have these figures to latch on to. And I feel like the medieval aspects get lost most of the time.
Yeah, I think that fairy tales in general are interesting in their adaptability and in the way that they most likely do stem from this oral tradition. But our conception in America of fairy tales right now has been so influenced by late 17th, 18th, and 19th century writers that they kind of got frozen. So the stories, when you orally tell a story, it's going to change and there's going to be jokes and there's going to be things that get added in. But once you write a story down, it's pretty set and that becomes the story. And so when we adapt these tales now, we're not adapting from an unbroken oral tradition. We tend to be adapting from texts that are between 200 and 400 years old, and I think that gives it an interesting character. We do have Disney who ends up making these tales over in an image that speak to the American dream, like you're saying with Snow White and the Depression, or Cinderella in the 1950s. But he's also conscientiously using sort of our understood language of fairy tale, which is 18th and 19th century or medieval, which I think kind of in public imagination, the two centuries and then sort of the time period of medieval, which has all kinds of debates raging within it, get really like lumped in as one in our heads.
Wait, you mean to tell me that Marie Antoinette did not die of the Black Death?
No! Oh my gosh. Nor was she Victorian.
And I thought those powdered wigs were English.
Oh gosh, there were some. Just,
All right. So, for the Sleeping Beauty itself, Charles Perrault's version was not the first iteration of the story. By no means.
No.
Among the earliest we find is Persephorist, which was published in 1528. And the 14th century story, well, it centers around this princess named Zeladine who falls in love with Troilus, who I just can't help but imagine as Zac Efron in one of those gladiator outfits from 300. Anyway.
I mean, that would be great.
Yes. Oh my gosh. If only. Kenny Ortega, get on that. But anyway, her daddy sends him on errands to prove himself worthy. But soon Zelandine falls into an enchanted sleep due to a piece of flax getting jammed within her finger. And like all respectful men of his time, Troilus has his way with her while she is unconscious, and she gives birth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The Sleeping Beauty texts, they are rarely completely wholesome, so it's a wonder that Disney managed to make something clean out of it. But anyway, later on, her child draws the flax out and she awakens. Miraculously. Also, it turns out that Troilus had given her a ring that makes her remember who the baby daddy is, and they soon marry. The end.
Yeah, the Perrault sort of has a similar thing where they end up they sleep together and have kids, but she is not unconscious for that part. It is implied consensual in the Perrault, but and implied that they've been married somehow, although it doesn't exactly say the marriage. But yeah, the story in Disney and in the 1908 film that we watched ends pretty much with the princess waking up when the prince comes to the castle, and everybody celebrating because yay, the kingdom's been saved, the evil witch or the evil fairy that cast the spell has been defeated. The end. But that is not where the Perrault ends. The Perrault has the prince come after 100 years of this princess being asleep, and she wakes up and everyone in her castle wakes up, and then the prince comes to visit her for 2 years almost every day, and they have a couple of kids, it says, but he doesn't want to tell anybody about the princess yet because he doesn't think that they're going to understand. And also, fun fact, his mom's an ogre and he's a little bit worried about what his mom's going to say. And so the king dies. The prince becomes the king, and once he has become king, he brings his wife and his 2 children, who are named Aurora and Daylight, back to the castle. And the mom, the prince's, well, now the king's mom, who is an ogre, decides that she wants to eat the children. So then it gets like a little bit Snow White, actually, where she asks her huntsman to go and kill Princess Aurora, the child of Sleeping Beauty, not Sleeping Beauty herself, to kill Princess Aurora and serve her in a sauce à la Robert, which is actually a newfangled culinary tradition in Perrault's day. So this is just showing how modern his story is to his listeners. Like to us, it's all dated in 17th century, but it was like very of the moment for people who would have been reading and consuming this media at the time. So the guy goes to kill Princess Aurora, who is 4 years old at the time, it says, but she's just too sweet and he can't kill her. So he kills a lamb and serves that instead. The ogre mom loves it so much that she then asks for the son, and Daylight, the same thing happens. He's not killed. And then she loves that so much that she asks for the Sleeping Beauty to be killed, the queen. And the king / husband, used to be the prince at this point, is off on some hunting trip. And so they think that the ogre mom thinks the queen is dead. And then one day she hears the family like in a barn talking, and she gets very upset that she was tricked. and decides that she's going to have them all killed. So she fills a vat with toads and vipers and all kinds of other gross things and is going to throw the family in. But then the husband comes home early and is like, what is going on here? And the ogre mom is so distressed at the turn that things have taken that she dives into the vat of toads and vipers herself and is eaten. And that's the end of the story in the Perrault. And then the king is sad for a minute because it was his mom after all, it says, but then he lives happily ever after.
And they lived happily ever after with all of her disjointed body parts and blood strung all over the castle.
Well, this isn't the Grimms. He doesn't give us like bloody details.
I'm sorry. This isn't Germany. I'll remember.
Yeah.
For a second, I thought they were going to throw in some like Christian allegory and be like, "Oh well, do unto others what you wish to be done to you," or something like that.
No, that's much more German. That's much more in the Grimm's project to do the Christian stuff.
Yep. And yeah, I guess I would just add otherwise that Giambattista Basile, he also wrote a version in 1634 as part of his Pentamorone called Sun, Moon, and Talia. And basically it's everything that Abigail has described, except that the king orders her to be thrown in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's not. She's like, oh, I've done something terrible. Ugh. No,
her son is like, get in there. And I think it's a vat of oil in the Basile, right?
I believe so, yes.
I think it's a vat of boiling oil, yeah. Instead of toads and vipers.
Yeah. Which, of course, we have to open the door, the terrible door, and ask, is it better to be eaten alive by snakes or to be burned to your bones in a matter of seconds?
I don't know. I'm like, which one would be faster? They both sound pretty miserable, to be honest.
Yeah. It'd just be like falling into a pit of lava. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. I don't want either. I choose neither.
No.
Cake or death?
Yeah.
Cake,
well, these
please.
stories are already pretty gothic, so, I just had to ask. And then several authors, mainly Perrault, has given this tale a lovely little moral, which I will share at the end of the episode. But basically, the abbreviated version is, don't rush your way into love, just let it come to you, and you will be ready, and it's going to be so hot, and it's going to be magical. Just keep it in the pants, okay? You're just gonna, it'll be fine. So, how do you think we have handled that in the 21st century?
Handled the not rushing into love?
Well, yes, but also I feel I'm already thinking ahead to being like, okay, well, I don't think we're doing very well because I'd say pre-pandemic, the hookup culture was very, very strong. But quarantine has made us rethink how we connect with human beings, so...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that arguably fairy tales and Disney fairy tales pushed a lot of the insta-love kind of tropes onto us with their Sleeping Beauty, they get a kiss and oh, it's love, and Snow White, someday my prince will come, oh, there he is. Cinderella meets Prince Charming, done. But that also does happen in these 17th century tales. In the Perrault, the prince wakes her up and immediately she's like, great, this is it. I don't mind hanging out in this chateau for 2 years waiting for you, but we're already sleeping together and having kids. So it is sort of like this weird, they're kind of waiting, but they're not waiting at all either. I think Disney is trying actually to like retcon that reputation lately, though, beginning most notably with 2013's Frozen, where they have Anna wanting to marry Hans immediately and then having everybody be like, you can't marry a guy that you just met today. And, you know, spoilers for an almost decade old movie now, but Hans ends up being
the movie that made like $1.2 billion. We're good.
Yeah. But Hans ends up being a bad guy. And so while on the one hand, they're saying, like, see, we're now also promoting this idea that you shouldn't rush into love and that love isn't the way that the fairy tales always said it was. They also have her meet Kristoff and, like, within a day realize that she and Kristoff are in love. So they do retcon it, but they don't. Like, just because they're waiting for forever for the wedding to happen doesn't necessarily change the basic structure. And so I think they're, you know, in other films like Moana, they're just getting rid of love stories altogether. But yeah, I don't know. That is an interesting question about, well, and also just about the way that love works or factors into fairy tales at all, and whether or not fairy tales are meant to be about love, because love was not considered the basis of marriage until, I mean, it started to be a factor in the early 19th century. That's when people started talking about, like, maybe we should be in love to get married, and like love matches became more of a thing.
Maybe we should get married because your estate is worth £9,000, and you would make a very suitable spouse to my finest daughter, and you shall produce the most beautiful Aryan children, or something. I don't know.
Exactly. I mean, it really was about a transaction, particularly for the princes and princesses that are being discussed in the Perrault tales. Now, most fairy tales actually aren't about princess and princesses. Like when you get into the Grimms, a lot of those are about common people, like Hansel and Gretel. They're, you know, it's a woodcutter, and even Rapunzel isn't a princess. She's just the firstborn of the guy next door, and the witch takes her and puts her in a tower, which we've now all gone must be a castle. She's a princess, but she's not. So it is, and also speaking of Rapunzel, she gets pregnant in her original story, and then the witch finds out that she's pregnant and gets mad, and that's why she like hurts the prince and takes his eyesight away and all that. But the Grimms ultimately edited out that pregnancy because they realized that that just was like too unchristian as they got older and more conservative. But yeah, there is kind of this idea that like we should be in love, I think, now, and that love can be instant. But in these, it seems more like Cinderella's finding a prince because he's a prince and he's gonna get her out of this world that she's in. And like, I think it does say that they love each other by the end or something, but that doesn't seem to be the basis. It's not that she saw him and immediately was like, I am in love and he's my only one true love. It was like, this man's a prince. It's like Lizzie Bennet seeing Darcy's house and being like, oh, I really fucked up by missing out on that marriage proposal. Look how nice his house is. So
Yeah. I just think that maybe that should be something more scholars do. It's like we're all about the timeless analysis of fairy tales and fairy tale media, but I haven't really seen a lot that caters to the now, the times that we're living in.
So do you mean like people talking about how fairy tales are currently being used and adapted?
I mean more like the way that we have interpreted them for so long. It follows this linear track through history, and it's remained pretty consistent. But now that we're in a world where the economy in most places is shit, and we
Mm-hmm.
cannot, well, I'd say we are getting better in most places in terms of COVID, but we're not at the point where people feel comfortable having intimate physical connections unless they're already married or whatever. So it's just sort of like, now we're calling into the question of like, okay, once everything peters out in its own way, how do we interpret these stories going forward?
I mean, I think to get at that, you would really need to go into some adaptation theory. Like, I think you will find scholars that are working on this idea of where fairy tales are now. There's a great book that was published in 2019, I think, called The Fairy Tale World by Andrew Teverson. And it's edited by Andrew Teverson, but it's got a ton of different scholars who write on a bunch of topics under fairy tales. And some of it is looking at the tales in a historical context, but there are also nods to what is a fairy tale, like what about wonder tales and tales from Africa and from South America and from Asia and from India, and a bunch of like the worldwide, the global idea of a wonder tale, and how those factor in today. So it really looks at sort of I think what you're saying is that, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that we kind of look at fairy tales the same way that we have since the 19th century, when people started really doing work on fairy tales, like Andrew Lang with his blue fairy books and all his different colored fairy books, which sort of became, I think, the nugget for fairy tales being exported around the world. And that does in a sense mean that fairy tales, which were not necessarily indigenously European, because we can trace them down like trade routes, but they became European looking, and then they got exported to the world in these European clothes, and really became almost a colonialist project. So I think there have actually been a lot of calls in academia lately to decolonize fairy tales, which I think is a really important move and a really interesting thing to look at. Like, what is the effect of fairy tale in a cultural sense, and how the way that a fairy tale is presented or clothed or cloaked, whether it's in a medieval European look, or whether you're saying, oh, look, it's a Chinese version of Cinderella, even though Cinderella probably originated in China. So actually, we're looking at a European version of Yi Qian, most likely. But when you say this is the Chinese Cinderella as opposed to this is the European Yi Qian, like, what does that do to a mindset and a globalized world? How do fairy tales operate? I don't know if that made sense. Sorry if that was
No,
rambly.
that made perfect sense. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and say it to you and our listeners up front right now. I am begging some ballsy filmmakers to produce a gay Cinderella. It's practically made, like, it's like there isn't much you have to do. It's like you have this, and I don't want I don't want it to be like a gender swap Cinderella. Like, I don't want it to be like the man and his ugly stepbrothers. I want to keep that as it is. But if we could just have it so, like, you have this persecuted man who gets this help largely from female figures, and then has this transformation and is arriving at this ball. And you could even have it so that it's like, you could still have like all the eligible women of the kingdom are invited, but the prince isn't interested in anybody until our Cinder Boy comes up on the scene. And then, like, there really isn't that many adaptational changes. Please make that.
There are several books that are like LGBTQ focused with Cinderella. There's a sapphic version called Ash by Melinda Lowe, where it's not the prince that ends up getting with her. She does go dance with the prince, but she is actually interested in the prince's mistress of the hunt, and so she ends up with the mistress of the hunt. And I think that's a really interesting version for a lot of reasons. It's definitely worth reading. And then there's a version that tries but misses the mark called my fairy godmother was a drag queen. And it's fine. I like the ideas behind it. I feel like the author had some really good impulses. It is a gender swapped version in the sense, well, sort of exactly what you're saying. The main character is named Christopher Bellows, but he still has a stepsister and a stepmom, so it didn't like swap that out. And he falls in love with the prince figure, who's sort of an up and coming Kennedy-esque politico, and the prince figure doesn't feel like he can be out. He's worried about being out because of what that might mean for his political career. And they're all like teenagers, they're like graduating high school / first year of undergrad. So this isn't like they're adults. And then Christopher Bellows meets this drag queen, and who helps him to like understand that it's okay that he wants to be with this prince guy and the prince guy can be with him. But it uses a lot of semi-transphobic language, which I know the author didn't mean to be using. Like, I know it's also got some racial implications because the drag queen's the only Black character in the book. And there's some stuff that's almost vaguely racist. And I know that's not what the author meant. It just felt like they needed an editor for a sensitivity read, because it comes across like really a little bit cringe at times. But yeah, I think that you're spot on with that impulse. And I think there are creators that are trying to do it. We just need like a good one. And we need more of them.
And we need one who is fairly in the mainstream. Like, people know who they are.
Yeah.
And it's going to happen. It's going to happen. I will wait on bated breath.
Do you think that it would be possible to do a gay or lesbian Sleeping Beauty? And interestingly, was it just me, or was the prince in this 1908 film played by a woman?
No, I feel like it was a man.
Was it? Okay, I couldn't tell.
He felt like he had kind of like a boyish energy to him, especially when he was like, for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, which I do semi-recommend.
Yeah, it's 14 minutes. It's on YouTube. Yeah. Go watch it.
Yeah. He kind of plays around with all the sleeping courtiers and guards and whatnot while they're asleep. And first of all, it's weird because it looks like he's playing with corpses. But anyway. But yeah, he just sort of had that sort of like that mischievous quality to him.
Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't tell. At first I was like, it's a guy. And then I was like, this might be an actress. But again, I mean, these are people in 1908 when a lot of gender constructs looked completely different than the way that they look now. Because as hopefully most of your listeners know, gender is a social construct that changes across cultures and across time. So it is possible, like that this was an actor that would identify as male. But I don't know. It was interesting watching it because it almost struck me as feminine movements and feminine grace, which I think is interesting that you think it looks boyish and masculine. Like the way that we read that character really differently is interesting to me. And I do wonder if that just has some to do with our positionality from 2022 versus more than a century ago, watching these, and also as Americans when these were French people, like what was it like in France at this time? So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and if we want to go ahead and put a Disney spin on it, they're more open about pride than we are.
Yeah, well, France is getting more right-wing, but they have been traditionally. Yeah, I mean, it was real close in the last election with a far-right party. Ugh.
Oh my God.
Yeah, just watch out for France. It's not doing so great politically right now.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And I thought Bob Chapek was the devil. Anyway.
Oh, yeah.
We're not getting into that. That's a whole other podcast. We're not going to do that.
But yeah. What do you think an LGBTQ plus Beauty and the Beast would look like for you?
You mean Sleeping Beauty?
Oh yeah, Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah.
Sorry. Or
It's them
Beauty and the
damn
Beast.
bells.
Let's do both.
Yes.
It is those bells.
Yes. Oh, man, this is gonna be like the headcanon episode. I was not planning on this at all, but I'm so excited. Let's see. For Sleeping Beauty, I really feel like it depends on the gifts that are bestowed to the prince. I don't know if I'd want them to remain feminine gifts or masculine gifts. Maybe a blend.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also wish for them to be more relevant to the story. Because,
Yeah.
well, first off, in Perrault, we didn't mention that there are 7 fairies that
Mm-hmm.
come to bestow gifts. And I don't... In the version that I read, they didn't really specify what their gifts were.
Let's see real quick. They do talk about what they are in this, and in particular it's basically that they are giving her all of the things that a princess at this time period would have needed to learn growing up, so that basically she's going to be a genius immediately. It says they began granting the princess blessings. One fairy declared she would be the most charming person in the world. The next, that she would have the mind of an angel, that she would do everything with exemplary grace, that she would be a fine dancer, that she would sing like a nightingale, that she would play an assortment of instruments to the highest perfection. So those would have all been qualities that a princess or that a woman at court would have been expected to have. So essentially they were just fast tracking her education.
Okay. Because I was wondering if it's like, are they going to be more abstract gifts like grace or patience or gentility? Or is it going to be stuff like, you can freaking dance like the guy from Psy or something?
I mean, she will be a fine dancer. And dancing was very important for both men and women, really until probably the 1950s. I mean, look at Gene Kelly. But like, I know, yeah, look at Gene Kelly. But yeah, so I do think like now, I think the idea of dancing is associated with a more feminine attribute, but it definitely was a non-gendered attribute. Everybody needed to be a good dancer in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So yeah, she was getting things that would have been good for women in her position in the 17th century in the Perot, but also things that were just good for any courtier to have: a keen mind, charm, that kind of stuff.
Okay. I do wish that they had given her some sort of external gift that was like barrier from spindles.
Right. I also do think like, I guess I'm trying to remember how it happens in the Disney version, but in this one, the seventh fairy kind of senses that the mean fairy is going to play a trick. Like she's already showed up and is in a bad mood, so she holds back. And then when the mean fairy is like, and she's going to prick her finger and die, the youngest fairy says,
Take comfort, your majesties. Your daughter shall not die. Really she won't. My power, it is true, is not enough to undo all that my aged kinswoman has decreed. The princess will indeed prick her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall merely fall into a profound slumber that will last 100 years.
And then she says,
At the end of that time, a king's son shall come to awaken her. Really he will.
And I was like, why not make it a year? Like, why? I just don't understand why you chose 100 years. That just seems like really bad planning.
We think that this baby girl is so beautiful that she will outlive us all, and she will commandeer her own race of people, and we will fall to ruin.
I just don't understand why, if you had the option to make it a year, maybe she didn't. Maybe the 100 years was the best she could do. But it just seems like that's an extensively long amount of time.
Although, to be fair, the 100 Years' War happened after all of this, right?
I'm trying to think. When was the 100 Years' War? I don't remember. There were there were wars this whole time. Everybody was at war all the time. So let's see.
Because what is it good for? Absolutely nothing.
No, it was before, I believe. Yeah, it was 1337 to 1453. But then we had an 80 Years' War. That might be what you're thinking of, because the 80 Years' War was 1568 to 1648. So that would have been still going on within I guess it ended when Perrault was 20, the 80 Years' War. And that was I know the Netherlands were involved, and I think Spain. Yeah, it was, the 80 Years' War, or the Dutch War of Independence. So yeah, that would have had to do with Spain. But yeah, European history. Yay!
Yeah. Well, I know that I'm deviating further from my gay headcanon of Sleeping Beauty, but anyway, that kind of brings to mind the 2015 live-action version of Cinderella, where they're trying to have the prince wed off to a Spanish princess.
Oh yeah, they are, aren't they?
Yeah. So
do you think do you think maybe that's because in Ever After, the Drew Barrymore version, they have the Spanish princess that he's supposed to marry? Because the Drew Barrymore version does borrow a lot from the animated film. In some ways, there's a lot of things that the animated Disney film pioneered that a lot of Cinderella versions after took from it. But then that version almost became its own touchstone for future adaptations. And I felt like there was a lot of Ever After in this Disney live action Cinderella. But yeah.
Yeah, it kind of felt like a blend of Ever After, but also just general, like, late 1940s Hollywood style. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily the Disney Cinderella, but just sort of like, that very elaborate hair crown atop her head, which was glorious. I've seen people do, like, video comparisons with her hairdo and, like, Dinah Shore in Till the Clouds Roll By, because it's, like, pretty much the exact same look, and I'm here for it. Anyway. But yeah, that's just, maybe they're being a little meta in that version. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I know with the costuming for the live action version, Sandy Powell, the costume designer, talks about how she was trying to set it. She didn't have any set time for it. She was thinking of it as quote unquote fairy tale time. But the costumes were a mix of 19th century inspiration with 1940s and 1950s because of the animated film having been in 1950. Even though that's not when it's quote unquote set, but it kind of was drawing on that mid-century, 20th century look with a 19th century vibe, because we all kind of think of fairy tales as being set in the past, the once upon a time. So yeah, that it could well be that that's part of the design going on.
Yeah. Kenneth, you're a genius. Anyway, going back to the gay Sleeping Beauty. What would be a good curse to put on a male Aurora?
Yeah, because it feels like the spinning wheel and spinning feels like a very femininely coded attribute, It also interestingly seems to have to do with like spinning a story, spinning a tale, so you've kind of got those resonances going on.
Yeah. Maybe I was thinking of like a semi-fatal like sword wound, but that seems a bit much. Man. I don't know. Stubbing a toe while practicing a dance. I don't know.
Jousting accident.
I don't know. Would I make them athletic? Maybe. Two manly men. Anyway. Yeah. Stuff to ponder. But anyway, I guess we've done quite a bit of conversation about the final product, which we witnessed with our eyeballs. But did you have any more like thoughts that could lead into like a like a shortened like plot breakdown or something?
It is 14 minutes that is essentially the Disney film, but without dragons. And as you pointed out, the prince just goes around and plays with the sleeping people instead of actually having to fight to get to the princess in any way.
Mm-hmm. Although I think it's interesting, starting right off the bat, when we get to when the evil fairy comes to bestow her curse.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting that they have her as an older character, whereas in the Disney adaptation, she is a much younger, fairly middle-aged. Age is not really a huge factor of Maleficent's character, but, still, there is quite a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a really good article by a scholar named Elizabeth Belle I think it's called like Soma Texts in the Disney Shop. But it is about the body, the way that the bodies and ages of Disney women look, so that young women are always the ingenues and princesses, and old women are always the helpful fairies and the good guys. But for Disney, the middle-aged women, who would be women sort of at the height of their power, end up being the evil ones. So it's like, if you are young and naive and moldable, then you're a good guy. And if you are older or postmenopausal, your body has ceased to be threatening or to be seen within sort of our Western culture at the moment. Whereas like the women who are evil are the evil stepmother, are Maleficent, are these women that are not yet actually postmenopausal, that are kind of still able to wield power, which it's a really interesting argument, the way that they do that. But yeah, I think the fact that it is an old fairy actually goes along really well with a lot of fairies in 18th and 19th century British illustration. Not So fairies are also difficult to talk about because there's lots of classes of fairies. Like, you get like sort of the children Victorian flower fairy look, but then fairy godmothers are kind of an entirely different kettle of fish. And a lot of the times in 18th and 19th illustration, they would be old. So actually this older fairy really reminded me of the way that Cinderella's fairy godmother looks in a lot of different versions. But you'll also notice that she was styled a lot like a witch. Like, she had a witch hat. She looked like a witch.
She moved around as if she had horrible back problems.
True. To emphasize her age, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Also, we get a sense... Oh, no, I just remembered something else in that same scene. They literally forecast the effect of the curse in front of the king and the queen. Like, they literally show her what their baby girl's gonna look like at age 16, and then she freaking dies. And unlike other adaptations, not just the Disney version, they don't leave it open to like abstraction, or they don't try to foreshadow that in a way.
Yeah, no, I actually thought that was a really good special effect too, with showing that scene playing out behind the scene. Like, they see it in the throne room or whatever, wherever this christening is happening. I thought it was a really well done scene, technically speaking.
Mm-hmm. And then we move on 16 god-forsaken years to where we have a princess who is a little more playful, a little more mischievous. She kind of is like, you know what? I've been guarded my entire life. I don't know why everyone is making such a fuss over me. I just want to go off and have some fun around this damn castle. So she ends up catching the attention of this guard, and she locks him in a room. He goes off. She's like, fuck you. I'm going to go hang around by myself. And then he decides to send other, more official guards in another direction. And she finds the lady with the spindle. Oh my god, who could it possibly be? It's the fairy. And then she pricks her finger, dies. The king and queen are obviously freaking out, legitimately so. And then the fairy who gave the remedy is like, You shall not despair anymore. I already told you like 16 years ago that your daughter is going to be just fine. Now get the hell to bed. And so she encloses the entire kingdom in like shrubbery and greenery and whatnot, which reminded me of the 2014 Maleficent.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like they have her set up in the beginning of that film as this forest child in basically Pandora, who like handles all of these thorns. They make it more of a faction of her foresty being as opposed to like some magical spell that she could just whip up whenever dealing with enemies or whatever.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. I could see that. Yeah, I do think it's interesting that the good fairy is the one that was putting the shrubs all around the castle, which is actually what does happen in the Perot, where they enclose the chateau and shrubbery essentially to keep people out until the right prince shows up. So instead of being a deterrent the way it is in the animated film, it is more of a protective measure, and not to protect the evil fairy's interests. But yeah, I thought that that was good. And I thought the scene where she pricks her finger with the old woman, the effects in that were interesting. And like you say, it is the fairy, but then it was almost like it wasn't the fairy. So I was kind of like, did the fairy just like cohabit that woman's body for a brief moment? Because it's this old woman, and I will say in the Perot it's not the fairy, it's just some old woman who hadn't gotten the memo about the spindles, like she just didn't know. And so it almost seemed at first like that's what they were doing. And then the old woman becomes the evil fairy again in a really nice little, I'm sure super easy to do special effect, but I bet in 1908 it was pretty cool. We had just seen moving pictures. And she's like, haha, I'm an evil fairy. And then she goes back to being the old woman. And then the old woman is legitimately freaking out about the princess being asleep and like runs to get help. So I was like, maybe it was just like a possession thing for a moment.
Oh, you thought... Because I thought it was the fairy in disguise.
Well, that's what I thought it was too, until until after she dies, when the old woman, who I had also imagined to be the fairy in disguise, was like, "Oh no, the princess!" and like went to get help. And I was like, "But you did this. How did you?" Again, watching this film was a lot like watching somebody do a charades version of Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah. Next thing you know, they'll bring in an exorcist. But anyway, 100 arbitrary years pass before a prince comes along with this hunting party. And the greenery, the shrubs, they all part because he is the chosen one. And he decides to mess around Pierrefonds castle and all the people. There was one lady who was leaning against a stairway. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, like, okay, fairy magic in this sense is kind of weird because it makes people be in suspended animation, but it doesn't make them basically drop dead.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I figured it'd make more sense if you just had more people just laying at the bottom of the staircase instead of being like, I'm here posing for a portrait or something.
Yeah, although don't they have a lot of people kind of doing that in the Disney film too? Everybody kind of falls asleep like as they are.
Yeah.
To be fair, it's been a minute since I've seen that film.
No. I think you're right. But some of them, it's like they kind of slump over and stuff. Yeah. Whereas a lot of these people, they just had their heads down.
Yeah, they were clearly just standing there.
These are the worst extras ever. No. But anyway, he hangs around, messes with the courtiers, the cooks, the guards, whatever. Finds out that they have no alcohol in their cups, which I don't know why he felt like he could just come in and get a drink, but Prince is gonna Prince. Mm-hmm. And then he finds the princess's bedchamber, and he had in this scene he had the kind of energy that's like it was very like very silent film energy where it's like all of my gestures are big and I have to let the audience know that I am enraptured by this unconscious woman and I must give her a big smooch on, I think it was on the hand, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, but he just had kind of like that emphasis on gestures and stuff like that, which is to be expected, but it was a bit much.
Yeah. No, I thought that the scene was interesting too, in the sort of kiss on the hand, no real overt, I don't know, sexuality in it. I guess there kind of was, like, in the movements and style, but yeah, part of me was wondering if it had to do with the time period, that, like, oh, we can't have, like, kissing on screen. Again, I thought maybe this had something to do with if it were an actress playing the prince, that they couldn't have two women kiss on screen. um because there was the early silent film The Kiss, which is like 12 seconds long and is a kiss. So I was like, maybe kissing's okay. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure where France would have been with on-screen kissing in 1908. So yeah, I thought that it was an interesting moment for sure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to be fair, in England you have women, countless women, playing Peter Pan,
Yeah.
which brings up the whole potential theory of lesbianism throughout each production, but we're going to save that for a later podcast. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think, like, the whole idea of the theater as a gender bending space, and, you know, even like going back to in England with Shakespearean plays where, you know, you couldn't have actresses on stage in England. So Shakespeare's major female characters were originally played by boys or men. Um, so yeah, I think there is, like, this tradition of gender bending, and then in England as well there's a tradition of pantomime dame. So you have, like, a man playing a woman in all the pantomimes, and then in the 18th century and I guess 19th century as well, but I studied 18th century theater, so I can't say for certainty that this goes on, but there's breeches roles where younger girls play boys, and then they wear breeches, and it's really sexy because you can see that they have two legs instead of just a skirt. And yeah, so I kind of was like, is this prince a breeches role in that way? But again, all I really know about the style it's coming out of is that it is part of, like, the theater féerie. But I don't really know anything about that tradition. I haven't studied French theater, so I'm not in a position to say with any authority, like, what the tradition would have been in France for gender on stage or in cinema.
yeah. Yeah, maybe that's actually where we should fall on the gay Sleeping Beauty. It's that it should be a lesbian story and not a men's story.
Yeah,
I think that's where it should go.
I think a sapphic Sleeping Beauty would be amazing.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I would love that. I also, like, definitely have ideas for, like, sapphic Rapunzels. So, you know, like, but yeah, I think one that is more akin to, like, Ash, the Cinderella adaptation that I mentioned earlier, except with Sleeping Beauty, would be really interesting. And there may be some out there. I haven't, like, studied adaptations of Sleeping Beauty as in depth as I have with Cinderella, obviously. So
Yeah.
yeah.
But regardless, she wakes up, and the fairy who gave the remedy reappears, and in her cloud of sulfur or whatever, it's some suspicious smoke. She comes and reanimates the nobility and the courtiers and all that, and they have this procession in the grand hall, which I guess is meant to announce their marriage, or
I
just
thought
that they
so.
made it.
Not sure.
Oh, yeah. But either way, that's the end.
Yeah, it's 14 minutes, real short and sweet. Yeah, probably really good if you're into silent films.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And that's part of the whole thing that I like that was part of the goal I had when starting this podcast. Is like, we know that animated adaptations of fairy tales are what the general public understands, but there is a greater tradition that it's pulling from that isn't just literary. So I kind of wanted to give a voice to some adaptations that are worthwhile, and I can assure you that I did not pick anything that is problematic in 2022. So we're in good hands. Except for Pinocchio. There's a weird section where, and it's a complete deviation from the book, but they have Pinocchio and Geppetto. They are captured by Native Americans after they escape from the whale. And Geppetto is about to be cooked alive by the Native Americans. And Pinocchio is made some sort of chief, and they suspect him of being a magician, which is very weird. But then they both escape, but then Pinocchio makes it to a Canadian soldiers camp, and they return him to Italy via cannon.
That is very strange. Okay.
Yes. And unfortunately, they had title cards in that section that specified that they did kill all the Native Americans.
Oh, that's rough. Yeah.
But otherwise...
Yeah, history can be an interesting and terrible place.
Yeah. Well, that's La Belle au Bois Dormant.
The end.
So, I guess the final questions that I have set up for you. How do you think La Belle au Bois Dormant illustrates how the Walt Disney Studios, in terms of like film production and storytelling and whatnot, how do you think it contributes to how their films are made up to now?
How does this 1908 film contribute?
Yeah, at first it may sound like there isn't a correlation, but it could be something as like, they know that they can't tell stories that are 14 minutes long and still like drive an audience to be like receptive, stuff like that.
I mean, I feel like all of these films are going to be films that are pushing the medium because the medium was so new at the time. And Disney has always been an entertainment studio that is working with cutting edge technology. So I think that in that way, you could say that most likely, if Walt didn't see this exact film, he probably saw films like it or in its style, and he might have even seen this exact one. So this is the early vocabulary of filmmaking. These are the early novels. These are the early books, much like we can say that contemporary novels are born from an 18th century novel. They might not look like they have that much in common, but the form of film is being set in these early silent films. And I think in particular with these fairy tale films, Walt got interested in fairy tales really, really early on in his career when he was like 20, 21. And so I think that these and fairy tales were one of the first stories to be turned into films. They were just culturally there. So there's a ton of these little short 14-minute, 10-minute kind of different tales. So I'm sure that having that vocabulary in place when he started out making like his laugh-o-grams, which I think we're going to talk about later, like definitely influenced how he ultimately made films. And while today's, Tangled or Frozen doesn't necessarily look like this film, I think you can probably trace a trajectory from this to his early animations to the 1959 Sleeping Beauty and on into today.
Mm-hmm. Definitely add color, at the very least.
Well, they didn't have that technology.
You
mean like diversity, or do you mean like actual Technicolor?
Well, of course I mean diversity, but I also mean glorious Technicolor. But
yes, yeah. Well, I agree on both counts.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And technically we can't even say that about this one because somebody just did weird stuff with like the clothing and the drapery and stuff like that. I don't know what happened. There's some prints that are like in standard black and white, but
I think they actually did do this. Again, I don't really study filmmaking in this period, so I'm not the authority to go to, but I do think that there were these sort of hand colorizations. They do it with black and white photos, definitely. So most likely somebody could do it with a film print. But yeah, it's sort of like the costumes have sort of splotches of color. So like the princess is in a pink dress and the witch is in a blue dress, and but like their faces their skin has no color. The backgrounds don't really have color, so it is an interesting technique.
Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to say that it is in nothing else that we watched. So I think that's a good enough place to close this chapter on Disney Reel to Reel. Abigail, thank you so much for accompanying me for this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for asking me to do this. This was really fun.
Yeah, and I hope to have you back here when we finally get into Walt's first animation endeavors and a certain German filmmaker from... You see, there's kind of a big thing that happened. There was a feud between Cinderellas. You remember the feud with Snow White in 2012? This is the early version of that. So, more to come in the upcoming months. So, until then, have a magical day, everybody.
Many a girl has waited long for a husband brave or strong. But I'm sure I never met any sort of woman yet who could wait 100 years, free from fretting, free from fears. Now, our story seems to show that a century or so, late or early, matters not. True love comes by fairy lot. Some old folk will even say it grows better by decay. Yet this good advice, I fear, helps us neither there nor here. Though philosophers may prate how much wiser 'tis to wait, maids will be a sighing still. Young blood must when young blood will.